You wake up, you move, you work. You try to stay consistent, and yet it feels like you're always behind. Not in a dramatic way, not in a failure sense, but in a quiet, persistent pressure that never really leaves. There's always something catching up to you. Bills that arrive faster than expected, expenses that feel slightly higher than last month, goals that seem to move just a little further away the moment you get closer. You adjust, you cut back, you try to optimize, but the gap doesn't close. It stretches. Because what you're experiencing isn't a lack of effort. It's a mismatch between how fast you move and how fast the system moves around you. You think progress is linear. Work more, earn more, save more, and over time things should stabilize. But that assumption only works in a stable environment, and this isn't one. Prices don't wait, markets don't pause, systems don't slow down so you can catch your breath. They move continuously, quietly, relentlessly, and most of the time, faster than you realize. So while you're measuring your progress in steps, the system is moving in momentum. That's why it feels like you're always catching up. Because you are, but not to where you started, to where things have already moved. And by the time you reach that point, it's already shifted again. So the effort isn't the issue. The direction isn't even the issue. The speed mismatch is. And until you see that clearly, it will keep feeling like you're doing everything right and still falling slightly behind. And the more you try to compensate with effort, the more subtle the pressure becomes. You wake up earlier. You try to be more efficient. You cut unnecessary spending. You do what you're supposed to do. But the system isn't responding to your effort. It's responding to its own structure. Inflation doesn't adjust based on how disciplined you are. Markets don't slow down because you're trying harder. Costs don't stabilize because you've decided to be more responsible. They move independently. And they move collectively. Housing, food, energy, access, everything shifts together. So even when you gain ground in one area, you lose it somewhere else. And over time, that creates a constant feeling of recalibration. You're always adjusting, always catching up, always slightly behind where you thought you'd be. And what makes it more difficult is that the movement is subtle. It's not one big jump. It's small, continuous shifts. Prices inch upward, standards increase, expectations quietly rise. And because it's gradual, you don't notice it immediately. You just feel the pressure. And eventually, that pressure starts to feel normal. You stop questioning it. You start adapting to it. You assume this is just how life works. Always moving, always adjusting, never fully arriving. Not because you're incapable, but because the system you're inside of was never designed to move at your pace. The baseline is not fixed. You think you're working toward a level, a point where things finally stabilize, where income holds, where pressure eases, where it starts to feel like enough. But that level doesn't stay where you left it. It moves. Not suddenly, not violently, but constantly. Rent shifts upward. Food prices adjust. Services increase. Access becomes more expensive over time. And none of it asks for your timing. None of it waits for your situation. So while you're climbing toward stability, stability itself is moving higher. That's the part that creates the tension, because you're not chasing something fixed, you're chasing something that drifts. You increase your income, but the environment expands with it. You improve your position, but the system recalibrates around you. And it doesn't feel aggressive, it feels subtle. A small increase here, a quiet adjustment there. Nothing that forces panic, but enough to prevent stability. And over time, that subtle movement compounds. Because consistency is what compounds, not intensity, not effort. Consistency. So the baseline keeps rising, whether you notice it or not, and your progress has to keep matching it. That's why it never feels like you've arrived, because the definition of enough doesn't stay still long enough to reach. You get closer, and it moves. You adjust, and it adjusts with you. So the gap doesn't come from failure. It comes from movement. Constant movement. And most people respond the same way. They try to increase effort, work longer, push harder, take on more, move faster. But speed doesn't solve a moving baseline. It only keeps you in alignment with it for a moment. Then it shifts again. And that creates something subtle. Not stress, not panic. Instability. A constant need to adjust. A constant sense of recalibration. You're always correcting. Always responding. Always trying to stay even. But never fully settled. Because the system you're inside of doesn't hold still long enough for you to feel like you've reached it. It keeps moving, and you keep adjusting with it. If this feels familiar, if you've felt this pressure but never had words for it, this channel isn't here to motivate you. It's here to help you see clearly. If that resonates, like the video. Subscribe. More clarity is coming. You assume income grows with time. But if you stay consistent, it will eventually catch up. That effort translates forward in a straight line. But income doesn't move the way the system moves. It reacts, it lags, it adjusts slowly, while everything around it adjusts instantly. Prices update in real time. Markets reprice continuously. Access shifts without warning. Entire sectors move before you even notice the change. But your income waits. It waits for raises, it waits for approvals, it waits for cycles that move far slower than the environment itself. So even when you improve your position, you're improving inside a system that has already moved ahead of you. That's the gap. Not effort, not intelligence, timing, speed, structure. The system moves at capital speed. You move at labor speed. And those two speeds are not the same. Capital compounds continuously. It builds on itself whether you are present or not. Labor compounds conditionally, only when you're active, only when you're working, only when you're present. So while you're progressing step by step, capital is scaling without interruption. And that difference doesn't feel obvious at first. It feels small, manageable, almost invisible, because early on, the distance is narrow. But time changes that, because time favors what compounds automatically and works against what requires constant input. So as time passes, the system accelerates in places you're not participating in. Assets grow, costs adjust, standards increase, access tightens, and your income tries to follow behind all of it. But it never quite aligns, because it's always responding after the shift has already happened. Then the gap shows up in cost, in access, in positioning, in options, in the difference between what you can reach and what keeps moving out of range.
and it keeps widening. Not because you slowed down, but because the system never did. So you respond the only way that feels logical. You increase output. More hours, more effort, more intensity, more attempts to accelerate yourself. But output doesn't fix a structural speed mismatch. It only stretches your capacity further, until eventually you hit a limit. Because labor has limits. Time has limits. Energy has limits. Attention has limits. But the system you're inside of doesn't operate within those same constraints. It scales beyond them, continuously, quietly, without needing your participation. That's why it feels like you're always catching up, because you are, but not to where you started, to where the system has already moved. And by the time you get there, it has already moved again. So the gap isn't something you close once. It's something that keeps reopening, because the speed difference never disappears. It compounds. And the longer you stay inside that structure without changing position, the more visible it becomes. Not as failure, but as distance. A distance created by two different systems moving at two different speeds. One tied to your time, the other detached from it. And over time, that difference defines everything.
At some point, it starts to click. Not emotionally, structurally. You realize the feeling isn't random. It's not inconsistency. It's not lack of discipline. It's position. You've been trying to keep up inside a system that doesn't stabilize, a system that moves faster than effort can match, a system that rewards what scales and slowly compresses what doesn't. So the question shifts. Not, how do I work harder, but what am I positioned inside of? Because effort inside the wrong structure doesn't compound. It resets. Every month, every cycle, every adjustment, you rebuild the same ground while the system continues moving forward. That's why it feels endless. Because it is, if nothing changes structurally. You can optimize your time. You can reduce expenses. You can increase effort. But none of that changes the direction of the system itself. And direction is what determines outcome. Not just speed, not just consistency. Direction. So the goal was never to catch up, because catching up assumes the system will wait. It won't. The goal is to stop operating at a speed that requires constant reaction, to stop depending on structures that reset every cycle, and start moving toward positions that hold. Positions where income doesn't fully depend on time, growth doesn't require constant input, progress doesn't reset when you stop, where movement continues even when you don't. Because that's the difference. Not effort, structure. Most people never see that shift. They stay inside the same loop, working, adjusting, catching up, repeating. Not because they're incapable, but because the system never taught them to look at it differently. So the pressure doesn't disappear, but it becomes clear. You're not behind. You're inside a system that keeps moving forward, whether you're ready or not. And once you see that, you stop trying to chase it blindly. You start paying attention to where you stand inside it, because that's what determines whether you keep catching up or whether something finally starts moving with you. Subscribe. Like this if it shifted your perspective.